So ready to go? Okay, well, let's talk about the poetical books. We're entering into this section. You know, King David was a poet and a musician. He was also a prophet and a king. He's sort of everything. But you know, Isaiah and Jeremiah were also poets. We don't often think of them as poets. But the book of Isaiah is almost pure poetry, same as the book of Jeremiah. They were songwriters. Moses was a poet. He was a songwriter. In fact, he's continued to write songs even after he's died and gone to heaven. How do we know that?
Song of Moses.
Song of Moses and Revelation. Yeah, that one isn't out of the Old Testament. That one's what he wrote after he got there. And it'll be interesting to see what other songs he wrote. Sometimes the New Testament writers express themselves poetically, or it appears that way. There's some debate over that. But much of the Old Testament is poetic. And so even as regards the prophetic literature that we're coming up on, we have the wisdom literature and the Psalms and various songs here that are written in poetry, and so we need to understand it. Most of what we've been through to this point has not been. There's been a couple of songs, like the Song of Deborah or whatever, but it's been narrative, historical narrative. But these next sections, including the book of Job, is written as poetry. Now, some things I'd like to point out is these poetical books are not history, although their poetry is rooted in history, and some of the psalms, some of the poems are of a historical nature. They recount their history. Different from, let's say, the historical narrative and especially the prophetic works, the Psalms, for example, this level of poetry is really man to man. Man talking to man about his need to worship God, rather than God to man like in the prophets. There's a universal nature to poetry that we see the same traits in Hebrew poetry as you would in our poetry. You know, things like it addresses the problem of suffering. It addresses the question of sin, or the conscience marred by sin. I think of Psalm 51 in that sense. It deals with the transience of life. You know, the fact that life is a passing vapor. You can see this in Ecclesiastes and other places as well. And of course, Song of Solomon, the passion of love between a man and a woman, and courtship and marriage, and all those things. So there's a lot of interesting topics that are addressed in these. One of the characteristics of Hebrew poetry, just like ours, is it's also filled with emotion. Hebrew poetry is very emotional. And again, not just the Psalms, but a lot of what you see in the prophetic literature can be quite emotional as well. And it was intended to be sung. I find it funny, there's this one, what do you call her, music scholar, I guess, that tried to come up with a scheme to figure out the musical notations for the Psalms. She believed that you could tell from the Hebrew letters what the notes were supposed to be. And then, because the Psalms do have meter, but they don't have rhyme. And of course they don't have any notation system, but they make reference to certain songs or approaches to songs or styles of songs. And so she tried to come up with a scheme to actually figure out what the notes were. And everyone smiled. But did get a book published. So,
Sounds like David was more of a rapper then.
yeah. That's right. And, you know, some people point out that David used a Canaanite musical instrument. And so, therefore, it's okay to, in the worship of God, to syncretize with the culture or use whatever the culture values or whatever. But you have to remember that David was a Canaanite. You know, his forefather, Judah, married a Canaanite. And his family line came from his incest with his daughter-in-law, who was a Canaanite. So David was half Canaanite, you know, and the Jews were partially Canaanite in their culture, and so naturally they would have the same musical instruments that the Canaanites had because they were essentially culturally Canaanite. God had called on them to be different, but they were already having Canaanite influences before they went to Egypt. Now, Characteristics of Hebrew poetry. You can see these in the Nelson Study Bible, beginning about page 876. There's different definitions and examples, and you should have had this in the hermeneutics class. If you haven't had that class yet, we'll talk about some things. And one of the main characteristics of Hebrew poetry is called parallelism.